The rain had ended only an hour earlier, leaving a cool metallic smell drifting through the cascades and a thin silver mist curling around the trunks of the Douglas firs. In places, the fog still clung to the hollows of the forest floor, moving in slow ripples as if the mountain itself were breathing. It was the kind of morning the locals avoided, quiet, unnervingly still, the kind of silence that presses against your ribs like a physical weight. But for Jason Redmond, this sort of silence was the best welcome a mountain could give. He tightened the strap of his helmet, rolled his shoulders to loosen up, and glanced over his machine and experimental mountain enduro prototype that only a handful of engineers in North America had ever seen. The frame was matte black titanium, wrapped around a 2-stroke turbocharged engine that purred even at idle. It was the most responsive, vicious, and flawlessly engineered off-road machine he'd ever tested, and today it would be pushed harder than any test session before it. "Let's see what you've got," Jason murmured, patting the fuel tank like it was a skittish animal. At 45, Jason wasn't the young hellraiser who used to dominate the enduro circuits across the Rockies and Baja deserts. He was older now, quieter, and carried the subtle limp of a man whose bones had been welded back together more times than he cared to count. But the fire, the part of him that couldn't breathe unless he felt an engine bucking under him, never died. It haunted him, kept him restless at night, demanded he ride. And now, he finally had a job that justified that itch. A billionaire tech recluse named Elias Mercer had hired him for one single purpose: test and map a network of trails across his private 6,000 acres of mountain wilderness. No oversight, no limitations, no schedule. Just Jason, the machine, and the forest. But the forest, as he quickly learned, wasn't empty. Mercer's land had a reputation, one that came with whispers, lowered voices in small-town diners, and a consistent lack of volunteers whenever someone needed to work in that area. The locals called the region Dead Mountain, not because it lacked life, but because the life that did exist was the kind you didn't want to meet. Rangers avoided patrols on Mercer's borders. Hunters refused to track wounded prey into those valleys. Even hikers, usually braver than they were, smart stayed away. Jason had laughed when he first heard the rumors, until now. He pushed the starter switch, and the motorcycle answered with a sharp, metallic snarl. It vibrated beneath him, impatient and coiled with power. The early sunlight cut through the trees in narrow golden rods, stabbing across the overgrown trailhead in a way that made the dust dance like drifting sparks. He eased forward. The trail swallowed him almost instantly. Towering moss-covered trees on both sides, the ground still wet enough that the earth gave off a soft hiss beneath the tires. Ferns brushed his boots. The air cooled as he sank deeper into the shadows. The isolation felt different here, not peaceful, not natural. It felt like a place that did not want him. That thought drifted into his mind uninvited, but Jason pushed it away. He'd ridden worse terrains. He'd broken bones in places far more hostile. Fear wasn't something that usually stuck to him, but something about these woods, something about the silence, felt wrong. He'd ridden for barely 3 minutes when he spotted the first one. A footprint. Jason braked so hard the back tire skidded sideways, digging a trench in the soft earth. He put a foot down beside the shallow depression in the mud. At first, he thought it was a bear track. Big. Wide. About 8 inches across. That alone wasn't unusual. Bears roamed everywhere around the Cascades. But the longer he stared, the more his stomach tightened. Because this wasn't a bear track. It wasn't even close. It had toes. Not claw marks, not paw pads. Human-like toes. 5 of them, and each toe was longer than Jason's thumb. The track itself measured 18 inches long and sat almost 2 inches deep into packed soil. Whatever made it weighed hundreds of pounds, maybe more. Jason crouched lower. Damp pine needles clung to his gloves. The mist around his ankles swirled as he exhaled. "No way," he whispered. This had to be human-made a prank, some backwoods joker trying to scare off trespassers. But then he noticed the stride. Several more prints led into the trees, each spaced nearly 6 feet apart. No human walked with a stride like that. No man alive. The forest around him creaked as the wind shifted. Jason felt the hairs on his arms rise beneath his riding jacket. He turned and scanned the trees. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. He was alone. At least, he hoped he was. He snapped a photo with his helmet cam and forced himself back onto the bike. The engine roared to life, loud enough to bounce off the trunks around him. The forest did not answer. No birds scattered. No squirrels bolted. It was pure, suffocating stillness. Jason pushed on. The trail tightened the deeper he went. Thick undergrowth scraped his boots and the sides of the bike. Fallen logs forced him to maneuver around them with slow precision. More than once, the fog thinned long enough for a beam of sunlight to slice the darkness, only to vanish seconds later, as if swallowed by something living. Jason's instincts screamed that he was being watched. By what, he didn't know. But something trailed him. Not close, not far. Just there. The kind of presence you feel in your spine long before your eyes catch up. When he reached a ridge overlooking a steep ravine, he shut off the engine to listen. No wind. No birds. No insects. Nothing. He swung a leg off the bike and stood still. That's when he smelled it. The odor drifted through the trees like a warm, damp rag pressed over his face. A brutal mix of wet fur, decayed vegetation, and something almost metallic, like overheated iron. It was thick enough to taste. Jason covered his nose. The stench was so heavy it felt alive, like it was crawling into his sinuses and clinging to the back of his throat. What in the hell? The smell wasn't from a bear. He knew that immediately. It wasn't cougar, elk, dead deer, or any animal he'd ever encountered. This was primal, ancient, like the odor of something that evolved under different rules than the rest of the forest. A low vibration rolled through the ground beneath his boots. He froze. Not an earthquake, not thunder. A footstep, a heavy one. Then another. Closer. Jason swallowed hard. He turned toward the sound, slowly. At first he saw nothing. Just the same unmoving trees, same fog pooling between roots, same dull green glow beneath the canopy. Then a shadow shifted. Something massive stood between two firs, partially hidden, almost impossible to distinguish from the darkness, except for the shape. The silhouette was wrong. Too tall, too broad. Shoulders as wide as a refrigerator. A head too high to belong to any animal he knew. And it bent, just slightly, as if ducking under a low branch. His heartbeat slammed against his ribs. His first instinct was to start the bike and tear out of there like the forest was on fire. But another instinct, older and deeper, kept him still. The shadow didn't move. Neither did Jason. There was a long, impossible moment when the forest held its breath. Then the silhouette leaned forward. A slow, deliberate shift. A glimmer of dull amber reflected through the leaves' eyes. Eyes that were not animal. Not human. Something in between. Something too aware. Jason stumbled backward and nearly tripped over the bike. He squeezed the starter. The engine coughed. "Come on, come on!" It sputtered again, then roared. Jason twisted the throttle, spinning dirt and needles behind him as he surged forward, and the shadow disappeared. Not backed away. Not fled. Vanished. Instantly. Like it had stepped sideways out of existence. Jason's chest tightened, adrenaline flooding his veins. He rode faster, pushing the bike harder than he intended. The forest blurred around him in streaks of green and gray. Branches whipped his shoulders, roots cracked under the tires. He didn't look back. Not because he wasn't curious, because he was terrified of what he'd see if he did. By the time the trail widened into a forgotten logging road, Jason had nearly convinced himself the silhouette had been a trick of light fog, trees, imagination, adrenaline. The smell lingering in his helmet must have been a dead animal nearby. The vibrations, his own pulse. That was the lie he fed himself. But deep down, he knew better. He slowed to a stop, breathing hard, and scanned the area again. The forest here was less dense, patches of sunlight breaking through the collapsing canopy in jagged beams. It should have felt safer. It didn't. He noticed something carved into a nearby tree. Not claw marks, not normal weathering. Letters. Old, rough, barely legible letters. Turned back, Jason stared at the message, feeling a chill creep down his spine as he reached out to touch the wood. The carving was old years, maybe decades, but the warning felt fresh. He mounted the bike again, but paused before starting it. For the first time since he arrived, the forest made a sound, a distant echo, a low yowl, deep and resonant, vibrating the air like the roar of something too large to exist. Jason snapped his visor down. The trail ahead dipped into deeper shadows. He gunned the engine and descended. This time, he didn't bother pretending he was alone. He knew now he wasn't. Whatever was out there had marked this land long before Elias Mercer bought it. Long before Jason set foot on it. And now, it knew he was here. And it had given him a warning he was too stubborn or too foolish to obey. Because the real terror, the real chase, the real discovery was still waiting deeper in the woods, where the trail narrowed, where the trees grew darker, where the footprints led, and where something ancient had just woken up. Jason Redmond had ridden for over 30 years, across desert dunes, rainforest mud, canyon ridgelines sharp enough to slice tires, and ice roads where the air itself seemed to freeze inside his lungs. But in all that time, through all those races, injuries, near-death crashes, and moments where instinct alone pulled him away from disaster, he had never experienced silence like this. It was the silence of an animal holding its breath, the silence of a forest waiting for something to begin. Jason rolled the throttle lightly, easing the prototype motorcycle into motion along a narrow stretch of trail. The engine hummed beneath him with a smooth metallic tone, hungry and responsive, despite the tension in his grip. The sunlight barely penetrated the canopy now. Everything felt colder, deeper, almost subterranean. He kept glancing at the trees, not because he expected something to jump out, but because every inch of him, every ancient hunting instinct coded into human evolution, was screaming that he was not alone. The trail curved left, dipping into a low valley where moisture hung thick in the air. A faint rattling echoed between the trees, the wet leaves trembling not from wind, but from vibration. He felt it through the handlebars, a steady pulse, like footsteps, heavy ones. Jason slowed to a crawl. Not again, he muttered, though his throat was tight. The smell hit him next, stronger this time. A potent wave of wet fur, mud, damp bark, and something sharp and metallic beneath it, like heated iron or old blood on stone. It choked the inside of his helmet and made his eyes burn. He almost turned around. Almost. But the part of him that made him who he was, that stubborn, fearless, reckless part forged from decades of racing, refused to retreat from shadows and superstition. Just an animal, he whispered, though he didn't believe it. Just then, something moved between the trees. Not a deer? Not a bear. Not anything he could categorize. It wasn't the speed of the movement, it was the size. A tree trunk shifted. A shadow too wide to be a branch slid behind it. A low rumble vibrated in his chest, like a warning spoken in a language older than human memory. Jason froze. For a split second, he saw it clearly. No tricks of light. No illusions born from adrenaline. A figure stepped between the ferns, 9 feet tall, broad as a doorway, covered in dark, coarse hair, with shoulders that brushed tree limbs 8 feet off the ground. It wasn't fully visible, only enough to prove it was real, enough to destroy any illusions of safety. The creature's slow exhale steamed in the cold air. Its eyes reflected faint amber like a wolf's. But the intelligence in them wasn't animal. It saw Jason, and it recognized him. The creature straightened to its full height, and the forest seemed to lean away from it. Jason's hand snapped to the throttle. That was all it took. The creature roared. Not like a bear. Not like anything that should exist on Earth. It was a sound that cracked through the forest like thunder splitting a boulder. A sound that seemed to push the air aside rather than travel through it. Jason reacted before his brain caught up. He twisted the throttle to the stop. The motorcycle exploded forward, and the creature charged. The engine screamed as Jason tore down the trail, branches lashing at his jacket, roots snapping beneath the tires. Mud sprayed in a long trail behind him as the prototype devoured the distance. The speed built sharp and immediate, 30, 40, 45 miles per hour in seconds. But the creature kept pace. He heard it to his right, thundering through brush, ripping through undergrowth that would have stopped a truck. A chorus of cracking wood erupted as it bulldozed a path parallel to him. Jason risked a glance. A towering blur of dark fur launched between the trees, impossibly fast, impossibly close. Jesus! He leaned the bike left hard, carving a line around a fallen cedar. The back tire fishtailed through wet soil, the engine howling as he corrected the slide. The trail dipped suddenly, rolling into a steep decline, and the front suspension compressed with a heavy thump. He didn't brake, he couldn't. Gravity became his ally, maybe his only one. The bike rocketed down the slope at a speed no test rider would ever approve. Branches whipped past his visor in a flurry of brown and green. The wind punched through the vents of his helmet, cold enough to sting. Then he heard it. Not behind him. Alongside him. The creature burst out from the tree line with a speed that defied logic. Easily 45 miles per hour, maybe more. It wasn't running like a man or an ape. It moved with a strange, terrifying efficiency-long strides, mixed with powerful arm pulls, using trees, rocks, anything to launch itself forward. It wasn't chasing blindly. It was matching him, studying him, learning him. The realization hit him like a blow. It knows the terrain. It knows how I move. It's waiting for me to make a mistake. Jason pushed harder. The trees blurred. The ground vibrated. A dead log loomed ahead too big to swerve at this speed. He stood on the pegs, shifted his weight, and launched off it like a natural ramp. The motorcycle sailed into the air, suspension fully extended. For a moment, Jason hung suspended, weightless, breathless. The landing slammed through his spine as the bike bottomed out, but he stayed upright, barely. Behind him, he heard a second impact, a heavier one. He wasn't imagining it. The creature had jumped the log, too, and landed without hesitation. Jason's heartbeat hammered so loud it drowned out the engine noise. He didn't think, he acted. A hard right turn approached, banked on one side by a natural berm of roots and dirt. He entered the curve too fast, the tires biting into loose earth that sprayed out in a wide arc. Gravity tugged him sharply downward as he leaned far enough to scrape a foot peg. The creature didn't slow. It cut straight through the curve, shortening its path, crashing through saplings like they weren't even there. Jason's breath hitched. "It's predicting me," he gasped. It's cutting the line like a racer. This wasn't an animal. This was something evolved for pursuit, something built for the hunt. He didn't have time to think more. The trail widened and dipped again. Straight. Smooth. Perfect for speed. A mistake. The creature transitioned to all fours and accelerated like a nightmare, stitched from the fastest parts of every predator on Earth. Jason twisted the throttle until his wrist ached. 50. 55. 60. The prototype screamed with everything it had. But the creature was gaining. He heard the thuds of its fists hitting the ground, felt the vibrations through the handlebars, caught flashes of its massive shape between trees. It was close enough that he felt its heat. Close enough that if he fell, even for a second, he'd never get up again. Up ahead, the trail narrowed into a ravine. Deep grooves carved by decades of meltwater. Sharp rocks jutted out like broken ribs, and tangled roots hung from the steep banks. It was the worst possible place to ride fast, perfect terrain for the creature. Jason downshifted, engine braking skidding the rear tire sideways as he dove into the ravine. Rocks pinged off the skid plate. The front fork bucked violently. He wrestled the handlebars with both arms, teeth clenched. The creature entered the ravine behind him, not carefully, not cautiously. It dropped into the ravine with a heavy crash that shook a rain of dust loose from the cliff walls. It moved forward like a tank, smashing rocks aside, tearing roots from the earth. Jason reached the end of the ravine. Two trails split, left tight trees and no visibility. Right, a narrow bridge across a dry wash. The decision had to be instant. He went right. The bridge was old weather-beaten planks dark with rain, probably decades out of repair. Not built for the weight of anything heavier than a hiker. Definitely not built for what followed him. Jason rocketed across it, the boards groaning under his tires. Halfway across, he heard a roar so loud it rattled the helmet hinges. The creature reached the bridge and placed its weight on the first plank. A crack split the air. Another. A chain reaction of snapping wood. Jason didn't look back. He flew off the far end of the bridge, suspension slamming as he hit dirt again, alive purely from momentum and luck. Behind him. Boom. Half the bridge collapsed. Jason skidded to a halt, spinning the bike around. The creature stood on the far side, chest heaving, its massive hands curled around broken beams. It did not try to jump, did not roar, did not smash the ground in frustration. It simply stared at him. Those amber eyes burned with something far more complicated than anger. Something like calculation. Something like recognition. Jason's breath caught. "You're thinking," he whispered. "Aren't you?" The creature straightened slowly, almost deliberately, then stepped back into the trees and vanished without a sound. Jason didn't wait for it to return. He gunned the engine and flew down the trail, adrenaline surging through his blood like rocket fuel. His arms shook. Sweat dripped down his spine. He barely registered the pain in his hands from gripping the bars too tight. He thought he was safe. He thought the bridge bought him time. He was wrong. Because minutes later, as he pushed deeper into the mountain, the forest began echoing again. Clacking sounds, low whoops, short whistles, coming from multiple directions. Not one creature, not a lone hunter. A group, coordinated, communicating. Jason felt the fear rise in his throat. This wasn't over. This had just begun. The forest around him shifted with movement. Shadows slipping between trunks, branches shaking high above him, heavy thuds echoing ahead. They weren't chasing anymore. They were herding him, steering him, directing him somewhere he didn't want to go. Jason leaned low over the handlebars. "No," he whispered, voice cracking. "No, no, no, don't do this." But the forest didn't care what he wanted. The creatures had a plan, a purpose, and Jason Redmond was being guided straight toward it. Jason Redmond had outrun cougars, dodged charging elk, and once escaped a black bear by climbing onto the roof of an abandoned ranger shack. He had faced mechanical failures, desert dehydration, broken bones, and the kind of crashes that make spectators look away. But he had never experienced pursuit like this. He had never felt hunted by something that seemed to know his next move before he made it. The prototype motorcycle bounced violently as he rode deeper into the mountain, its suspension still functional, but straining from the earlier impacts. Jason's legs ached from absorbing the shock. His wrists throbbed, his shoulders burned, and his lungs were scraping for air, as though the forest itself was stealing his breath. But the worst part was not the exhaustion. It was the sound. A pattern of low whoops and clicking tones echoed between the trees, sometimes ahead of him, sometimes behind, sometimes off to either side. They were communicating. Plural. Not one monster. Not one giant. A group. Coordinated. Fast. Relentless. Jason didn't know what terrified him more, the fact that they were tracking him, or the fact that they weren't closing in. They weren't trying to catch him. They were guiding him, herding him, steering him deeper into terrain no human had any business entering. The trail narrowed ahead, steep, slick, the ground matted with moss and pine needles. The trees grew so close they formed natural gates, forcing him to slow as he threaded between them. The bike's engine growled, echoing strangely, like the forest swallowed the sound and pushed it back at him in distorted patterns. "We're not doing this," he whispered to the machine. "You're not dying on me now." As if the bike were alive, as if it could hear the fear leaking through his words, he accelerated into a stretch of shadow where the sunlight barely reached the ground. The world compressed to a tight tunnel of darkness lined by ferns taller than a man's chest. The clicking sounds grew louder. There, off to the left, then to the right. A branch snapped ahead, clean and deliberate, not random. Jason swerved around a fallen log, slipping sideways before regaining traction. His gloves were soaked with sweat. Every muscle in his back trembled. He didn't dare look behind him, but he felt them. Eyes, more than one pair, watching, studying, choosing. The trail began to incline sharply. Even with the prototype's torque, the slope forced him to stand on the pegs and shift his weight forward. The front tire struggled for grip. He pushed the engine harder, and the bike clawed its way up. Halfway up the incline, a low vibration rolled through the dirt beneath the wheels. Jason froze in place. Another vibration. Another. Footsteps. Enormous ones. They were coming down the slope toward him. Jason's heart hammered so hard he felt it in his ears. He had two choices. Reverse down the hill, blind dangerous. Keep climbing straight toward whatever was descending suicidal. He chose something in between. He cut the engine. Instant silence. The forest exhaled. Cold, damp, heavy. Jason crouched low over the tank, holding his breath. Something massive stepped onto the trail 30 yards above him. He didn't see it. He felt it. The impact through the earth. The shift of air pressure. The soft rustle of enormous weight moving through branches. Then another presence joined it. Then a third. The three sets of footsteps converged. Jason gritted his teeth. He'd been fighting the truth since the first footprint. But now there was no denying it. There wasn't just a family of these things. There was a hierarchy. The clicking sounds intensified, overlapping, forming patterns. A conversation. And the tone of it. Not aggressive, not panicked, sounded almost like decision-making. Jason felt cold sweat run down his spine. They were discussing him. He didn't know how he understood that instinctively. But he did. Because he wasn't prey. He wasn't being hunted to be killed. He was being evaluated. A branch snapped to his left. Jason didn't move. Another crack, a tree limb being pushed aside gently, carefully. Then, For the first time, he saw one clearly. Not moving, not roaring, not charging, just watching him. From 10 yards away. It stood beside a moss-covered boulder, partially behind a rotting cedar trunk. It was shorter than the giant that had chased him, maybe 7 feet, but still broad and muscled, like something that had grown in a world with stronger gravity. Dark brown hair covered its body, but its face had expression. Eyes deep-set and intelligent. A brow ridge-wide and heavy. Nostrils flaring gently as it took in his scent. It didn't look angry. It looked curious. Jason swallowed hard. The creature blinked, slowly, almost thoughtfully. Then its head snapped upward. Not at Jason. At something behind him. Jason turned, slowly. At the base of the trail, emerging from the shadows like a nightmare climbing up from the earth, stood the one he recognized, the tallest, the one who first roared at him. The Alpha, 8.5 feet tall, shoulders nearly as wide as a mattress, breath steaming through the cold air. And this time, Jason saw something new. White streaks in its hair. Marks along its arms, old scars. A slow, deliberate posture of something too experienced to rush. The giant stepped closer. Jason's breath hitched. He tried not to tremble, but his whole body was shaking. The Alpha held out one arm and gave a short, low click, commanding. The smaller creature responded instantly, backing away into the trees without hesitation. Jason felt sick. This one was in charge. Of the others. Of the direction of the hunt. Of what happened to him. And it wasn't done deciding. The Alpha stepped forward again, closer. Jason gasped softly. He could smell it now. Earth. Bark. Damp fur. The faint musk of wildness untempered by civilization. It leaned slightly, head tilting. Assessing him. Jason's heartbeat thudded. He could feel it in his teeth. Its hand, massive, powerful, reached for the ground. Slowly, it pressed its palm into the dirt, leaving an enormous print. Then, it dragged the hand forward slightly, as if demonstrating a direction. A gesture, intentional, pointing. Down the trail. Away. Leave. Jason knew it, just as clearly as if it had spoken aloud. His throat tightened. "You want me gone," he whispered. The creature didn't react. Jason swallowed again. He couldn't run now. There was no space, no engine sound, no momentum. If he startled it, it could crush him in a heartbeat. He needed to obey. He reached slowly for the handlebars. The Alpha's muscles tensed. Jason froze. The creature let out a soft chuff, a warning, but not an attack. He moved slower. His glove brushed the rubber grip. The Alpha's shoulders loosened just slightly. Permission. Jason swung his leg over the motorcycle, keeping his movements small, unthreatening. He didn't start the engine immediately. He waited. The creature stood unmoving. Only its eyes followed him. Jason finally pressed the starter. The engine turned over with a rough growl, echoing in the stillness. He expected the creature to flinch, to roar, to lunge. It didn't. It stepped backward into the trees. A final gesture. Go. Jason did. He eased the bike downhill, rolling away with shaking hands. Every nerve in his body pulled taut like wire. The engine's quiet thrum was the only sound in the world. Until it wasn't. Halfway down the slope, he heard the forest shift again. But this time, it wasn't from pursuit. It was movement, spreading outward. Multiple creatures stepping aside, melting into the woods. Their silhouettes flickered between trunks, retreating into darkness, clearing a path for him, letting him go. By the time he reached the bottom of the incline and re-entered a less dense portion of the forest, Jason no longer felt watched. The clicking had stopped. The whoops had faded. The heavy footsteps were gone. He was alone again, or so he told himself. But the forest told a different story. It watched him leave, allowed him to leave, And Jason realized something terrifying. He had not survived because he escaped. He survived because they chose to let him go. A sick feeling rolled through his gut. Why? What did they want? What had he stumbled into? His bike rattled violently as he pushed deeper into the woods. The silence felt heavier now, like something withheld, like the forest had been reset, rewound, put back into place. But Jason's nerves were shot. Every tree looked like a shadow. Every shadow looked like a silhouette. Every silhouette looked like it might step forward. He needed shelter, a place to regroup, a place to breathe. And then he saw it. A small wooden structure half hidden behind thick ferns, a collapsed roof cabin or ranger shack, leaning to one side like an old man about to fall. He killed the engine immediately, not because he was being stealthy, because the bike was wheezing, barely holding together. He dismounted with trembling legs and approached the shack. The door hung crooked on one hinge. Moss covered the roof. A gap in the wall revealed tangled vines inside. But it was the inside that froze his blood. Human writing, scrawled all over the interior walls in old marker, scratches, charcoal, anything the previous occupant had found. Messages overlapping each other, some frantic, some calm, some barely readable. Jason stepped closer. One message stood out more clearly than the others. "They don't kill right away." Another, "They watch you first." And one written in large, uneven letters, "They decide." Jason's throat tightened. He felt the sensation again, the pressure in the air, the weight of something ancient watching from the trees. He turned toward the fogged windows. Shadows shifted between trunks, not approaching, observing. Always observing. Jason stepped back from the wall, fear choking him. The creatures had shown themselves, communicated, judged him. But what terrified him most wasn't their size, speed, or intelligence. It was the realization that settled cold in his chest. They had a society, a structure, a culture, a purpose. And he had just become part of something he didn't understand, something he was never meant to see. He wasn't being hunted, he was being tested. And Jason Redmond knew one thing with absolute certainty. The test wasn't over. It had only begun. Jason Redmond had always believed there were only two kinds of fear in the world: the fear that keeps you alive and the fear that makes you stupid. But this was something else entirely. This was the kind of fear that rearranges your understanding of reality, the kind that follows you like a shadow, the kind that rewrites who you are. He stood inside the abandoned shack, surrounded by the words left behind by someone who had clearly lived through what Jason was only beginning to comprehend. They don't kill right away. They watch you first. They decide. Those messages weren't warnings. They were verdicts. And now Jason knew he was on trial. His heart hammered. Sweat cooled on his forehead. The shack seemed to tilt, the air thick with the smell of rot and wild earth. Every instinct told him to keep moving, keep breathing, keep fighting, or die. He took one step toward the door, and the forest went silent. Completely. A suffocating quiet rolled through the trees like a wave, flattening every sound. Wind, birds, insects, everything. Jason felt the pressure of it in his chest. They were back. Not one. Not the two he'd seen. All of them. He didn't see them, not yet. But he felt their presence. Massive, intentional, unhidden. The shadows outside the shack deepened, as if something enormous blocked the sunlight. Jason's pulse spiked. He backed away from the open doorway and turned toward the motorcycle. It leaned against the shack's outer wall, half buried in ferns, the prototype engine ticking softly as it cooled. The machine looked wounded, bent, nearly broken, but still usable. He grabbed the handlebars and dragged it through the moss and weeds. "You're my only way out," he whispered to the bike. "Don't quit on me. Forest twilight swallowed him as he stepped beyond the shack. The canopy thickened overhead, leaving just enough light to see the trail in uneven patches. Shadows slipped between the trunks. Silent, massive, careful. Jason froze. Something shifted to his left, another shape to his right. Then, straight ahead, the trees parted with a low groan. 3 creatures emerged, not rushing, not attacking, not hiding. They stepped out as if they had been waiting for him. Jason's breath stopped. The smaller one 7 feet tall, almost lean compared to the others, stood on his left. Its hair was darker, its movements quicker and more agile. It scanned Jason with sharp, curious eyes. The scarred one, maybe 6'10", heavy with old injuries across its chest, stood on his right. Its posture was tense, like a brawler ready to break something if given the signal. But the one in the middle, the tallest, the alpha. It towered above the others, nearly 9 feet tall, shoulders so wide they seemed to fill the space between the pines. Its eyes locked onto Jason with an expression he couldn't decipher. Deep, ancient, and impossibly aware. Jason's hands tightened on the handlebars. The alpha took a step forward. The ground trembled. Its breath steamed in the cold air. Its chest rose and fell in heavy, controlled motions. Its face, partially shadowed, was both primal and unnervingly human. Jason swallowed hard. He was close enough now to see details he'd missed before streaks of gray around its jaw, scars along the thick ridge above its brow, and an old fracture shape in its forearm that had healed crooked, suggesting a life full of violence. And yet, there was intelligence there. Judgment. Restraint. A far cry from the mindless beast that hunters fantasized about. The alpha tilted its head. Jason felt something inside his chest collapse. "Why me?" he whispered. "Why are you doing this?" The alpha blinked slowly, purposefully, not answering the question, acknowledging it. Then it exhaled, a deep, rumbling sound that vibrated in Jason's ribs. A command, a signal, a decision. The creatures behind it stepped aside, spreading out, not to trap him, but to reveal a narrow corridor between the trees. A path. Jason stared. "You want me to leave?" he breathed. The alpha lowered its chin. Not a nod, but close enough. Jason's fingers twitched on the handlebars. His legs shook as he swung a leg over the motorcycle seat. The bike wobbled under his weight. He kept his eyes on the alpha, terrified that any sudden movement might trigger a different sort of decision. He thumbed the starter. The engine didn't catch. His blood went cold. Another attempt. Nothing. Just a groan and a series of coughing clicks. The scarred creature tensed. Jason froze. "I just need one try," he whispered to the engine. "One more." He pressed the starter again. This time, the engine shuddered and roared to life. Jason felt like collapsing in relief. The alpha didn't flinch. Jason didn't wait for anything else. He guided the bike forward at a slow crawl. The creatures stepped backward in perfect unison, opening the path for him as if they had rehearsed it. The forest corridor stretched ahead, dark, narrow, sloping downward. Jason kept his eyes up, scanning the giants until they were only shadows between trees. He did not look back. Not because he wasn't curious, but because he feared that looking back might undo the fragile permission he'd been given. The corridor twisted through thick brush and narrow turns. Branches slapped against his shoulders, moss dragged at his boots, but the creatures did not follow. They watched. He could feel their gaze on his back, heavy as gravity itself. Only when he reached a ridge where the forest thinned did the feeling ease. Jason pulled over, shutting off the engine. Not to rest. Not to hide. To understand. He removed his helmet slowly. The air felt lighter now, the silence no longer crushing. He could hear birds again, a distant chirp, faint but real. The forest had returned to normal. He turned just enough to look back toward the hidden valley he'd been led out of. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. Just wind brushing the treetops. But in his gut, he knew. They were still there. They were always there, watching him until the moment he left their territory. The realization burned through him. He started the bike again, pushing downhill toward lower, safer ground. Every turn took him farther away from the feeling of eyes burning through the trees, but his mind was still spinning. Why had they let him live? Why show themselves at all? Why reveal their numbers, their organization, their awareness? The answer came slowly. Not because Jason was slow to understand, but because accepting it meant admitting something terrifying. They weren't afraid of him, or of humans, or of discovery. They had shown themselves because they chose to, because they were in control, because they were protecting something: territory, offspring, resources, secrets. And Jason realized with a chill, he hadn't been pursued out of anger. He had been tested for trustworthiness. A rustling sound broke his thoughts. Voices, human voices. "Hey, over here!" Jason's heart jolted. He skidded to a stop near a clearing where two shapes appeared. Not giants, not shadows. Forest rangers. One a fit woman in her 30s with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, held a first aid kit. Her jacket bore the name Chen. The other, a younger man with freckles and red hair, carried a radio. His name tag read Morrison. They rushed toward him. "Sir, are you injured?" Chen asked, eyes scanning him for blood or trauma. Jason didn't answer immediately. His throat felt tight. His mind was still in the valley with those creatures. I'm fine," he said eventually, though his voice sounded wrong. "Wrist is maybe sprained." Morrison lifted the bike to inspect it. "This linkage is shot. Must have been quite a crash." Jason managed a hollow laugh. "Yeah, something like that." Chen looked at him carefully, more carefully than most people would. She saw the tremor in his hands, the exhaustion in his shoulders, the haunted look in his eyes. "You saw something," she said quietly, not as a question. "Didn't you?" Jason's mouth opened, then closed. He could tell her the truth. He could tell someone finally. He could share the burden. But then he remembered the Alpha's gesture, the silent command. "Leave. Speak nothing. Keep our secret." Jason shook his head. "No, just wildlife. Big wildlife. Spooked me. Nothing more." Chen didn't believe him, but she didn't push either. "Let's get you out of here," she said, "before you go into shock." The hike back was slow and quiet. Morrison retrieved the motorcycle while Chen walked beside Jason. She asked routine medical questions. He answered them distractedly, but his thoughts stayed in that valley. With the giants, with the test, with the decision they'd made, with the decision he now had to make. When they reached the ranger vehicle, Jason paused. The trees behind them rustled softly, just once, like a farewell. Or a warning. He turned his head, searching the shadows. Nothing. Chen noticed. "What do you think you saw?" she asked gently. Jason took a long breath. He thought of the shack, the messages, the creatures forming a corridor. The Alpha's eyes not savage, not cruel, but heavy with judgment. "I think," he said slowly, "there are things in these mountains we don't understand. And maybe we're not meant to." Chen held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, almost imperceptibly. "That's the smartest thing I've heard all year." They reached the trailhead. They reached his truck. They reached civilization again. But Jason didn't feel safe. Not because he feared the creatures, because he feared breaking the one rule he finally understood. They let him live because they trusted him to keep their world hidden. His hand brushed the camera mounted to his helmet, the one that had recorded everything. The creatures had seemed aware of it. They had acted like they knew they were being filmed. And yet, they had allowed it. A chill spread down Jason's spine. What if the footage was part of the test, too? What if they wanted to see what he'd do with it? He drove home in silence. When he reached his garage, he connected the camera to his laptop. The footage loaded frame by frame, and Jason's heart froze. Large sections were blank, not static, not corrupted, just empty. As if the camera had been turned away at specific moments, as if something had interfered with it, as if the creatures had known exactly when to avoid being recorded, or when to be recorded. What remained was vague enough to be dismissed. A few shapes, a few shadows. Nothing the world would accept as real. Nothing that would expose them. Jason leaned back in his chair, breath shaky. They had controlled the footage. They had controlled the encounter. They had controlled the outcome. He shut down the laptop. Then he removed the memory card, placed it in a small locked box, slid the box into his gun safe, and closed it. No one would ever see it. Not because he was scared, because he owed them that. The creatures had tested him, judged him, chosen to spare him. Now it was his turn to choose. He wrote a single sentence in his notebook, his own version of the shack's warnings. They let me live. I won't betray that. Then he closed the notebook and turned off the lights. In the darkness of his garage, the shadows seemed to shift for a moment. But when he blinked, they were just shadows. Just shadows. Still. He whispered to the trees outside. I kept my promise. And somewhere deep in the Cascades, far from roads and trails and human noise, something ancient shifted through the forest, listening, hearing, and, in its own massive, quiet way, accepting.